started?
Let's see. I believe so now. It has started.
All right, good.
Yep, here we
There
are
we go.
on the second confirmation there. Good, there's no random noise coming through there as well. Wonderful, excellent.
Good.
All the good things.
Other than the kitties running around.
The kitties running around is fine. I expect that.
That's going to be fun.
In fact, this is totally nothing to do with anything, but as we wait for people to gather and as I tweet out all of this and we wait for just a few of you to get here so we can begin our podcast, I was going to set us up in the studio since I have the whole, because we'd be more comfortable in the office chairs and the background is fun. I really like it. The lights and it makes me really happy. So I was going to do that, except then I realized that our adorable kitties can't be adorable and come in and hang out with us at all. And cats.
I like this
and
this spot. I mean, look at it. It looks good.
I know. It's the CherrySTEM spot, and now especially that I've added the appropriate
leopard print. It's an absolute necessity.
The red couch is an interview couch, but I haven't had any interviews on it yet. But that's what it's for eventually. Alright, good. Ready and waiting for new messages. I'm sure they'll start coming up whenever we get into this. Now I'm like paranoid that it's not actually stream. Okay, it's theoretically.
Are you waiting for some particular individuals?
Bitrate is too high. Paula, what are you doing? 6,000 bitrate. I should probably lower that.
You probably have to stop and restart then, right?
I don't know.
Output.
No, there it is. I can adjust the bitrate.
See if that's.
Pablo, quit your bitching. Alright. Hopefully that'll fix it. Who knows? We'll see. It's giving me a warning. I don't really know what it means, but alright. Hopefully, I don't know. We'll see. I'll look at the replay on Twitch and we'll find out.
See, well, it may not have changed anything. It may not update unless you reconnect, but yeah.
It's possible.
Yeah. We'll find out.
Alright, so. So. We have a spicy topic tonight.
A spicy topic, definitely.
Very. So, morality and liberal versus conservative. We're going to talk about it. We're going to talk about the differences in the brain of liberals and conservatives. Yes, just like differences in the brain between men and women, you can find differences in the brain between liberals and conservatives.
And those two are really closely related. It's the
See what I did there?
Yeah, well, it's good.
No, I mean it's a really good metaphor example, but it is also happens to be related. That women are more liberal-like and men are more conservative-like as generalities in terms of like testosterone.
Because let's give a little context based on our previous. We're not calling it podcasts, but what, are we? Okay, sure. Our previous podcast,
as soon as I get an RSS feed, I'm putting it on iTunes and Google Play.
Good.
I just need an RSS feed.
But we were talking about autism and how much did we get into that it's the
Cherry 2.0. No warning, sweet. Cherry 2.0 started, 2.0 meaning on our channel instead of on the Honey Badger Radio channel.
Right.
So we had like a season there, and we have the second season here now.
Okay.
And I do have the audio clips, or the whole episode, available as an audio on Patreon for public viewing. Go to, up there above me, I believe, patreon.com/AnnaCherry. And you can find and download and even get an RSS private link to play in your favorite audio RSS player. So all the episodes you can listen to. And we started our CherrySTEM 2.0 series with one or two episode series on autism.
Yes. And so I'm going to kind of go from that. Like you're specifically as we prepared. I kind of prepared on using the context of autism and how it is.
Sure, it'll fit in there. I have a whole flow.
And you are you focus more on the political affiliation directly, but we're going to try to pull together the links between political affiliation, autism, and sexual brain.
I'm just saying we don't need to tell them.
Yeah, we do.
Okay.
We do.
That's like under the.
Yeah, no, but that's
behind the scenes.
Okay. You gotta tell them what you're gonna tell them, Then tell them, and then tell them what you told them.
What we're going to tell you is that humans are obsessed with morality. And what the fuck is morality? There's 5 foundations. And then where morality is in the brain. And then why the fuck are we even talking about left versus right in morality? Because that's what left versus right is. Mm-hmm. They're moral ways of understanding the world. And there are differences between left and right in the brain when it comes to that manifestation of those political beliefs in the brain. And autism comes into play, though
autistic spectrum, because it has to do with masculinization of the brain, which
may not necessarily be autism spectrum, or at least it may not tick all the same conservative checkpoints based on my
there's always going there's always
that should be interesting.
Yeah, okay, we'll talk about it, because I've got a lot of good studies on specifically the brain areas associated with autistic spectrum. And how it is that links to morality. How those are directly related to morality and differences in morality, and then how those are related to political affiliation is something that I want to talk about.
Cool. Yeah, as long as you have morality in the brain, because I have some, but I was realizing
that's what this is about. It's basically 2 different modes of morality, and and a lot of it has to do with individual versus the group, and everybody kind of gets the whole point that both are important, but then how you mix the 2 is a part of the homeostasis system between left and right.
I have a whole chapter on it.
Good.
In my notes.
All right, so you want to go first?
Well, I thought we just.
No, I mean it's cool.
I would just guide the thing and then call on you for things that fall into. So basically, do it like we've done every time.
Yes.
Every time. Every time. I tell you every time. Alright, so I'm distracted by this warning that I have 13 bit rates too many from what they recommend, but I'm going to try not to.
Don't worry about that.
Not to get distracted by it.
Out of 6,000. That's not something to be concerned with.
Alright, so, alright, where are we? Here we are. And we do have...
the only problem is the total bandwidth upload for 2 streams simultaneously, but we should be okay.
Hopefully, let's see. I do have the encoder, and so far it looks like we dropped 1% of frames in the 7 minutes we've streamed. So.
1 out of 100? That's not bad.
We'll see how it works out. Now, alright. So, last episode, specifically CherrySTEM podcast number 19, which you can find on the thing of Patreon, we discussed intelligence. So we're like, what is intelligence? And then we talked a lot about like creativity versus static intelligence. And so kind of going from there, the next question is, well, what is morality? Like what is even that? What is it even? There's like a lot of debate about that, as particularly in the sphere or current climate of atheism versus Christianity or other religions. There's just a lot of other religions like Islam, and there's questions about what is morality, who has it right, who's doing the right thing, who isn't. In fact, humans are obsessed with morality as mammals, as primates. That's something that primates do. They watch each other and they try to like divine motives for each other. That's what gossip is. That's what why we're obsessed with morality and figuring out why people do what they do. And there is a moral molecule. It's oxytocin. We can talk about that later. Which probably why.
Well, we talked about morality and game theory in the
while back,
last season, I guess, and how there is a reasoning. I mean, it's we kind of focus on what is the less known thing. Like it's obvious that everybody knows that competition is valuable in a certain for certain things. That's been shoved down our throats from birth. That competition is good. So talking about the reason why cooperation exists as a moral standard and how it benefits society and therefore benefits the individual, and how that works. It's basically a solution to a problem, and it is a rational solution to a problem. The whole idea that it's an irrational agent that behaves morally is just based on a overly simplified viewpoint. They literally call them an irrational agent, if they behave in any way altruistically,
right.
Whereas that's not actually accurate in light of our new knowledge about the way in which everything from bacteria to animals and how they all work together. It's just there's another level of complexity on top of the competition that leads to the rational, completely just dead rational solving a problem. There's nothing goody about it at all. It has to do with just solving a fucking problem.
Group cooperation, evolutionary game theory, all of it relies on altruism and cooperation.
So there is this dichotomy between what's good for the group versus what's good for the individual. And let me just say for a moment, it's something that's going to be underlying just about everything that I talk about, is the idea of a homeostasis system. So if you let me just kind of divert for just a moment here, there's one thing I wanted to point out. So I'd like to try to get you to consider the idea that everything in reality practically is works via homeostasis systems. And what I mean by this is that there are mutual there are this union of opposites that constantly happen. I'd like to use the example of an engine, and that is that we think of something as good or bad in a kind of a unitary fashion all the time, but that is simply what you can do is get too focused on something. So, like for instance, when you think of an internal combustion engine, I'm trying, and hopefully most people kind of understand that are listening, and that is, as the piston goes up and compresses the air, you can think of that as a good thing because, well, it's necessary for the efficiency of the next explosion that's going to happen. But you could also look at it negatively and say, oh, but we're losing all this energy to compressing the air. And then, and then the opposite, when it's at the very bottom, it's like, oh, it's a very bad place for it to be at the bottom of the piston, because of the fact that this is this whole situation is bad for an explosion. It'll be very inefficient use of fuel. The point is, there's a negative and a positive, and the idea that it is a constantly cycling. The homeostasis systems are cycling between opposites. In other words, and it is it's the constant cycling between these apparent opposites that drives an engine forward, and how it drives many things forward. And so whenever, like, I'm hoping to kind of talk about the negative aspects of an autistic spectrum viewpoint, but at the same time also be bringing forward the positive aspects of it and trying to point out how there is this shadow between the two, where there's both that everything I talk about is good, I also mean is bad in a certain way, and everything I talk about that is bad, I also mean is good, simultaneously. Almost every time that I'm saying anything, if I'm expressing an opinion about how it is bad, I am also completely aware of and want to say that it is also good in a different context, and try to point this out, that there is this cycling between things that
I love that so much, because in my section on the left versus right brain leading up to it, when we talk about where the disagreement comes between liberals and conservatives is, I will explain, there's a great video on it, and then the fact that you need balance and cycling between change versus stability. And there's a lot of Eastern religions have figured this out, and there's a quote from Sen, which says, if you want the truth to stand before you, never be for or against. The struggle between for and against is the mind's worst disease. So you are simultaneously, when you are for something, you're also saying against, and therefore canceling it out. Basically, there is no for and against. They both exist.
The point is to have them in the right balance. Right. I mean, it is important. Like an engine, if it has too much fuel, it dies. If it has too little fuel, it dies. If the pistons all just stayed exactly in the middle, the engine wouldn't work. And so there has to be a cycling between these polar opposites that is extremely necessary. And this is kind of an overall perspective that I've been trying to kind of hit upon in almost absolutely every one of these talks. Is there's this cycling between apparent opposites, where there is something that looks negative that is positive, and something that looks positive that is negative, because it is almost always both simultaneously, because of the fact that in certain circumstances it is bad, and in other circumstances it is good, and both of them are necessary in the proper balance and in the proper cycle to drive anything forward that is this kind of
but they're
union of opposites.
Coupled and almost like a backlash to each other. And I think a better metaphor instead of a piston, because I think that may be hard for some people to wrap their mind around, like me. Something like a paddle wheel, or like a water mill, or like paddling in a water, where it's like you're doing some sort of like.
Well, it goes back to the whole idea
motion
of growth and pruning. Like whenever you've got a search algorithm, you don't want to search directly down one line, and you don't want to search every single path, a little bit in every path, because you've only got a certain amount of search time. You want to have a balance between the two, and you don't want it to necessarily be just a direct balance, but more of a kind of a
right. But what you were saying earlier about it almost described a backlash of one political movement pushing the group in one direction, and then everyone sort of overcorrecting back in the other way. And something we had in our notes is you wanted to touch upon how whenever you're guiding, and this is something that I have in notes as well, to show how political affiliations have changed over the years. There's this neat graph.
Well, I'm going to get specifically down to particular types of morality that are going.
As you were you wanted to mention, I don't know if you remember this, but a while back you wanted to mention that whenever you're guiding a group of people, if you're like on a narrow road on a cliff and you're telling them to go right, and those people that are like
already going right, go too far right.
Can you talk more about that? Okay.
Well, yeah, whenever you're addressing a group, there is this constant problem of like people walking along a path, and that is narrow, and you're wanting. Some of them are going too much to the right, and some of them are going too much to the left. And when you start telling people, hey, you need to, tell these people who are going too far left, you say, hey, you need to go right. Well, they start telling everybody that you need to go right, and the people who are already going too far right go even further right. And the same thing is true with the left. Can you kill that?
Unprofessional.
So yeah, there is that problem, of course, but
anyway, yeah, just because we're talking about like left and right, and we can see how groups have changed over time, and there's been backlashes of one and the other, and they do sort of.
Well, the point is to get to like I personally to put it in some context. In my family, autism runs deep, man. They weren't necessarily. Diagnosed with autism, but one of the things that both me and my father share is macrocephaly. It's having a big head. No hat fits me, and it's kind of the part of the autistic spectrum. But the other thing is, I was so completely. I felt like data as a child. I just did not understand the faintest freaking thing about humans. So as I go in and criticize some of these
people
things,
celebrate that fact apparently.
Apparently, there are.
I love data. He's my favorite.
There are things that are deeply rooted in self-criticism from when I was younger that I will criticize about the autistic spectrum thought process because it has been part of my life process to find those things in myself.
Not like you don't criticize the overly liberal perspective.
Oh God, yes.
Either.
But I do both.
You should talk to me so much on a daily basis.
But the point is that as I get into some of the things that I find to be negative, a lot of the things that I was able to find that were part of my own growth process. I was always extremely good at a wide variety of scientific topics, and of course, but intelligence,
obsessive.
You're right. Intelligence was something that was important to me, and from an early age, I was able to recognize that my mother was capable of like running circles around my father in certain ways. But she, when it comes to like any kind of mechanics,
crazy men are stupid.
Right. Any kind of mechanical reasoning, any kind of any sort of that sort of thing. My father was far better than my mother, so I was able to see this kind of dichotomy between intelligence types, and I was able to recognize. And later in life, I remember hearing about women are better at. One of the first ones that just pops into my mind because it was one of the ones where there were studies of specifically that women outperform in general, outperform men in particular tasks, and one of those first tasks that I found was in naming words starting with a given letter. And then there was a variety of other ones, but I was like, so there's these types of intelligence that I want to be able to include in myself. I want to be able to find those places in which I am deficient, and bolster those specific areas. And so there's been a kind of a lifelong process of attempting to find in myself those deficiencies and find ways of fixing them. And so, I mean, as I will criticize some of the things about the autistic spectrum, which also has to do with right-leaning politics, which has to do with those sorts of things, as I criticize those things,
or does it?
It does. It strongly does. It has to do with masculinization of the brain, and it's.
But you can have masculinization of the brain without having autism.
Without becoming dysfunctional in a certain way, but the thing is, there is a level of, we have to go back to the whole idea of specialization. You're either an Olympic lifter or you're a marathon runner, and trying to be both makes you not as good at either. And
I don't think, what does that do anything? I'm just saying that
has to do with specialization versus generalization.
Right, so but we're talking about autism and testosterone, so it's like you may have a masculinized conservative brain because of testosterone, but autism may be incompatible with conservative ideas. In other words, people who are autistic do not actually hold any actual conservative ideas. They're artistic, but they're not religious.
I'm gonna have to see what you do.
They're not religious. They don't believe in any of the same ideas that conservatives do.
I don't know that I believe in that. I'll have to see your data on that, because that has not been my life experience, nor has it been the experience of.
And I'd like to see your data because
of looking through these studies. So it's neither one of those things.
I couldn't find my search for an answer to this was unsatisfactory. So I would definitely like to see your data. So all right, let's get back to the start of it. So morality. We mentioned how humans are obsessed with it, and we have 5 foundations of morality. So this was research. This is actually like quantifiable studies were gathered and research across cultures, disciplines, and even species. It was all collated together to try to figure out what the hell is morality. So it. I'm never not gonna love that sound. So yay, people really like the fact that we collated all this information on morality. So it fell into 5 general categories, or 5 very specific categories. But it generally fell into these 5 categories that people and primates and animals seem to be concerned with or behave according to principles. So these 5 foundations of morality are harm/care. So humans and animals seem to have caring behaviors, as well as protecting from harm behaviors, which is like underscores sort of like a moral approach to things. So like do no harm, like the 10 Commandments, like do no harm, things like that, like mothering instincts. There's morality is. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of what exactly that is on a anthropological and neuroscience level, but in terms of psychology, I suppose, or sociology, these are the 5 foundations. So harm care is the first one. Then we go into fairness, reciprocity. That's another thing that humans and other animals really care about, and there's great research on this in rats and monkeys, where they help each other out and they monitor fairness. Like rats actually monitor what humans help them out, and then they remember that human. So there's a lot of encoded, or these 5 things seem to be sort of underlined in our existence, in a sense that there's this idea of tabula rasa. I'm going to back up for just a second. There's an idea of a tabula rasa, which is a blank slate, a literal translation from Latin. Yes, and there's a book by Steven Pinker called The Blank Slate, which basically is a best-selling 2002 book that ended up getting a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And it argues against the idea of a blank slate.
Oh, okay, I was about to say, because God, that is stupid.
No, it shows that it very distinctly makes a case against tabula rasa and argues that human behavior is substantially shaped by evolutionary psychological adaptations, and there are very distinct ways in which we come pre-programmed with some things that we can do really, really well, and some things we can't do all that well that we learn, but there's definitely pre-programmed stuff. So morality in the brain, in a sense. And we have these 5 foundations that are across species, across disciplines, across human cultures. So they're sort of hardwired. So harm, care, fairness, reciprocity, and then next one is in-group loyalty. So that's a thing. Humans, I mean, animals usually have small in-groups, and they are most always family-bound, but obviously not always. You have like schools of fish and other things, but like whales are families, wolves are families. What are they called? Groundhogs, they're families. So a lot of times when you have a tribe, it's just an extended clan. It's like Japanese people all up in here. Asians, you have the 7 generations, and that's like a clan, a family, a tribe. Humans are a little better at sort of gathering together in not just families and gathering into tribes, and they really like doing it. They would do this all the time for everything, all the time. Like in schools, there's cliques, there's sports, there's constantly.
Well, there's also multifamily
liberals
primates.
versus conservatives.
Yeah.
We constantly organize ourselves into little groups, feminists, whatever.
But while still having able to exist in a larger group.
Yes, but there is still a desire to segregate and have us versus them battles.
Yes.
In sports, in school, and like all the time in human society. It's fragmented into cliques.
Yeah, I think that is an important part of sharpening ourselves.
Oh, this will get really interesting. And yeah, these are foundations of morality that liberals and conservatives hold, but they differ on. And this is where the crux is really. So in fact, this is a quote I just want to throw out there, which is great. It kind of changed my perspective on some things. That sports is to war as what pornography is for sex. That you get to exercise this sort of primal. Love it. Favorite quote. I want to put it on a shirt. So credit to a person whose name I can't remember. We'll see him in a little bit in a TED Talk. Unless that's somebody else's quote. He certainly didn't attribute it to anyone. But next one, so that's the third, in-group loyalty. That's the third foundation. Fourth foundation is authority/respect. So some sort of hierarchy in primates would be a good example, where you have deference to those that are above you, and you show respect, or you demand respect from those below you, and it's one of those things that seems to underscore a moral approach to the world, and is, once again, we'll get into left versus right, because there's some interesting differences there. And the final fifth one is purity/sanctity. So a really big part of morality, of course, is where you have this religious battle, atheism versus. So people like religious battle. So
Fight.
I should have worn my fight shirt. There's this battle between atheism and religiousness, theism. That go, well, which one is moral? You can't have morality without God, this idea. But obviously we see here with these 5 things that we come sort of pre-programmed with ideas of morality. However, liberal versus conservative, which does have a dividing line in religious thought, is one of those things that is the fifth, sort of purity, sanctity. It moralizes, religion moralizes what you can touch, what you can't touch, what you can put in your body, what you can't. That goes for feminism, that goes for other.
Harmful, that you don't know why it's harmful. But,
right, so the ideas of purity and sanctity, so there are some things that you can, and this goes for cultures, this goes for, for you can touch, what you can eat. If you think about it, huge parts of Islam and so Abrahamic religions, Christianity too, if you consider shellfish, and pork, and then whatever kosher, halal, all of that stuff. That is. Well,
that's Old Testament.
Yeah, all of them have something some food that you can't.
Judeo-Christianity.
Right. Yeah, all of the 3 Abrahamic.
The history of Judeo-Christianity.
People like histories of Judeo-Christian religions, or Galileo. I don't know which one. So, and that's the last sort of foundation of morality. So we have harm, care, fairness, reciprocity, in-group loyalty, authority, respect, purity, and sanctity. Those are the 5 sort of things that morality is comprised of. And when we get to conservative versus liberal attitudes, there are definitely differences in the brain. Between liberals and conservatives, and I would definitely love to get more into that. But we can also talk about morality itself being in the brain. Where is it? Where it's located? Sort of neuroscience approach.
We need to talk about that because those two subjects overlap.
Right. So also, let's cap off our conversation about morality for the psychological sort of aspect by looking at the short little video, and hopefully the way I did this will. Oh man, I'm so sorry. I'm not at all paying attention to chat. My bad. I meant to, but then I forgot. There we go. Oh no, Twitch chat is more cancer than YouTube chat. Holy shit. That's crazy. I'm sorry, Rush. I'm so sorry. You were scratching your asshole in dark again. I'm very sorry about that. We're here now. We're with you. So yeah, my bad. It's my first time actually using this system, and I totally derped. So hooray! But let's watch this motherfucker talk about some of this cool stuff, and hopefully I can get around the YouTube bullshit of having to pause it every 20 seconds and having to banana. It's the honey badger term for pausing every 20 seconds and then saying something so that it's like different to fool their algorithm. I know that sound is one of those things so hopefully we don't get dinged on that. And visually, I know they look at your like feed. So hopefully by putting our little feed inside our bigger feed, we can get away with it.
Yes.
And
work.
People on the podcast will hear it. Hopefully. Maybe we'll see. I'm streaming to 2 places, so as you can see, there's YouTube chat as well as Twitch chat because I'm doing both. So all right, where's the display capture? What? Huh? Oh, okay. I'm just retarded. That's cool. All right, let's listen to this.
But as my son Max grows up in a liberal college town, how is this first draft going to get revised? And how will it end up being different?
The draft that he's talking about is the 5, the harm, fairness, in-group, authority, and purity divisions, or understandings of morality.
From a kid born 60 miles south of us in Lynchburg, Virginia. To think about cultural variation, let's try a different metaphor. If there really are 5 systems at work in the mind, 5 sources of intuitions and emotions, then we can think of the moral mind as being like one of those audio equalizers that has 5 channels where you can set it to a different setting on every channel. And my colleagues Brian Nozick and Jesse Graham and I made a questionnaire, which we put up on the web at www.yourmorals.org. And so far, 30,000 people have taken this questionnaire, and you can too. Here are the results. Here are the results from about 23,000 American citizens. On the left, I plotted the scores for liberals. On the right goes for conservatives. In the middle, the moderates. The blue line shows you people's responses on the average of all the harm questions. So as you see, people care about harm and care issues. They give high endorsement of these sorts of statements all across the board. But as you also see, liberals care about it a little more than conservatives. The line slopes down. Same story for fairness. But look at the other 3 lines. For liberals, the scores are very low. Liberals are basically saying, no, this is not morality. In-group authority, this stuff has nothing to do with morality. I reject it. But as people get more conservative, the values rise. We could say that liberals have a kind of a 2-channel or 2-foundation morality. Conservatives have more of a 5-foundation or 5-channel morality.
They all equally sort of care about it.
Here's the data for 1,100 Canadians. I'll just flip through a few other slides. The UK, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Latin America.
So it was a little difficult for me to understand the graph at first, and this is also for people who are listening, and you can definitely watch the video. I will link it in the Patreon description. So we have the score from 0 to 5, so this is like how much they care about it, and then liberals on one side and conservatives on the other. So if you look at liberals, they really care about harm and fairness, while conservatives are like, they care about it a little less, but they also care about it. And then liberals are like, purity? Fuck that noise, like, you know, sexual revolution, baby. Conservatives? So for conservatives, all 5 are like pretty up there.
Right.
For liberals, though, there's a huge divide between like what they care about versus what they don't care about. And the interesting thing is this is like all across cultures. So we go, you know, the USA here. So
as you
who else
see,
is here?
People care about harm and care
23,000 for
They
USA.
give high endorsement of these sorts of statements all across the board. But as you also see, liberals care about it a little more than conservatives. The line slopes down. Same story for fairness.
People care about graphs.
But look at the other 3 lines. For liberals, the scores are very low. Liberals are basically saying, no, this is not morality. In-group authority, this stuff has nothing to do with morality. I reject it. But as people get more conservative, the values rise. We could say that liberals have a kind of a 2-channel or 2-foundation morality. Conservatives have more of a 5-foundation or 5-channel morality. We find this in every country we look at. Here's the data for 1,100 Canadians. I'll just flip through a few other slides.
Canadians,
UK, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, Latin America, the Middle East.
Yeah, basically whether or not these
Asia,
things are relevant to morality. It's the question of are these things
right.
relevant?
These 5 foundations. How much do people still care
believe
about them?
that these
between
things,
the left and right?
Do they believe that this thing is important to your idea of morality?
Right.
And specifically, he's saying that liberals believe that in-group authority and purity are not important to morality, whereas conservatives believe that they are.
Exactly.
Right.
And yeah. And what I'm actually rewatching here on mute is the interesting thing is that some of the countries, once you start cycling through them, some of them like Canada and others have like a little sharp tick in the middle for moderates. So some countries actually have a stronger presence of moderates than others. Others are just like a fucking line, like there's nothing. But in some others, they're like way kinkier than others. So I find that really interesting. I said they're kinky.
Slope is steeper on in-group authority purity, which shows that within any country, the disagreement isn't over harm and fairness. Everybody, I mean, we debate over what's fair, but everybody agrees that harm and fairness matter. Moral arguments within cultures are especially about issues of in-group authority
purity, and yeah. And so right. So there we go. All right. Where was I? Yep. Disagreement comes from this in-group authority and purity, which we can very easily see as the debate over multiculturalism. Then we have, which is in-group versus out-group. Then we have, which is where we have a huge divide between the two sides of the political spectrum. Then we have authority questions, which is anarchy, feminism, question authority, question patriarchy. That's like the whole thing. And then we have the ideas of purity, which is where atheism comes in, sanctity, purity, atheism, and sort of sexual liberation. They're like, fuck that noise. So one is change, and the other one is stability. So that's why there's so much emphasis placed on in-group authority and purity ideas in conservatism, because that is what keeps cultures stable. However, the liberals are necessary to say, fuck all that noise, let's start something new. Let's get Old New Testament up on this motherfucker. Let's just not follow the rules. And the thing, as I mentioned earlier, that the Eastern cultures have figured out, or religions have figured out, is that you need, instead of change versus stability, picking which one's better, you have a balance. And you go back and forth, yin and yang. They're not fighting, they're coexisting. Preserver and the destroyer, Shiva and Vishnu, they're coexisting. Buddhism, San Sang, which is, you want the truth to stand before you, never before or against. So, so we have these approaches to morality that left and right very much disagree on. So what is morality? Where is it in the brain? What is happening? What is even anything?
Oh, you're asking me now.
Yes.
Well, okay. So basically, let's step back just for a second to talking about that dichotomy between basically adaptation and stability. Let's talk about that again from the whole homeostasis perspective, because that is really important. Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I'm going to just interrupt you for just 5 seconds. 5 seconds.
Just 5 seconds.
Just 5 seconds. So we actually have an after show for patrons. I meant to say this in the very beginning, and then I kept forgetting, and then I was going to say it again, and then I kept... So we have an after show for patrons. It is only $7 a month to be part of our CherrySTEM tier, and you get access to after show hangouts as well as the call-in show at the end of the month, because we reached a milestone. We're going to be doing 2 of these a month. One is a call-in show, all you guys asking your questions, shooting the shit, and then a regular podcast. And the after show is something that you get access to through Patreon up there. And for people who are listening, patreon.com/AnnaCherry. And we have a video to watch, and it's going to be really fun and interesting. And it's about morality and how all of that works, and how humans sometimes aren't as moral as they think they are. And anyway, so go ahead.
Okay, so going back to the whole idea that I'm going to harp on, the idea of a homeostasis system, and trying to point out the importance of that both things are extremely valuable and both things have to be done, and they are apparently opposite. And that is, for instance, whenever you think about adaptation in specialization and these types of things that have to do with, so if you're very adaptive, that means you're willing to change. Now think about what that means, that you're willing to quickly alter your strategy based upon the circumstances that are occurring. Now, doesn't that also mean that you're very indecisive, that you're not working through the difficulties, that you're not pushing through? And the truth is, that's what adaptation is. It is not pushing through, because there's a time for you to not push through. There's a time for you to change strategies. But then there's also a time when you have to not constantly be switching off to other strategies, but instead push forward and push through the difficulties. And so there's this dichotomy between being adaptive, being able to look at all the circumstances, and you'll find this thing is very deeply ingrained in our psyches, and that different people who are more adaptive actually are that more liberal viewpoint. And what is it that a conservative would very quickly be able to identify as a negative trait about somebody who is liberal? They don't push through the difficulty. They don't. They're vacillating around. They're going between too many different things. But then, what is it that a liberal would see about a conservative? You're just an old fogey. You stick with one stupid thing and don't ever change off to anything else. You just keep right on going, no matter how many things happen that show you need to fucking change. You change nothing. So there's a dichotomy between these two viewpoints that we can see, in our everyday lives, that and both of them, however, are absolutely necessary, and they are opposite. And understanding that there are so many of these apparent dichotomies throughout life, that there are this union of opposites that has to vacillate between the two for it to work out. And that vacillation not only has to occur, but it has to occur in the appropriate timing, and it's dependent upon the situation. In other words, and that's the difficulty that we have that everyone has trouble with, trying to figure out when is the right time to be one or the other. And one of the things that every conservative mindset and people who are really all about science, what is it that I really loved as a child? What is it that I was seeking out from this kind of autistic sort of perspective? Things that were permanent, things that never change. Physics, the things that have to do with biology, have to do with what's happening with the stars. I was interested in that which does not change, because that was what was important to me. However, the truth of the matter is, everything is actually changing, and so many of the things that are occurring in our lives are all about dealing with change. And so that's one of the things that where I was able to see in my own perspective this kind of where my focus was versus where the other kind of focus is. And just one more example on that is that like one of the things I was able to see later on in life is this depth thinking versus breadth thinking, and it has a lot to do with the linguistics, and this links to autism, autistic spectrum, because linguistics and autistic spectrum are closely related. But
before you jump into that, I wanted to sort of underscore what you were just saying with some of the stats.
And see that whole switching around thing? We're doing it right now. That more liberal thing, instead of focusing forward. And I needed to finish what I was saying. Go ahead.
I thought you were done. I'm sorry.
No, I was not.
Well, I just wanted to
long track.
Interject to.
Yeah, I know. I'm just using what's available.
It's true. It isn't a good example though, because we do make a great team.
Right.
And you give me shit daily about being chaotic.
Pure chaos.
So to underscore what you were just saying, though, there's actually, in fact, I probably will share my notes with all the resources there. But there is, for instance, you can predict with about 69% accuracy, based on heredity, what someone will be, if they'll be a liberal or a conservative. So what their parents were.
Based on heredity.
Yeah,
which
about
is
69%.
both sociological as well as physiological.
Yeah. And then, however, there's some things that you can divine about liberals and conservatives by looking at brain volume. And this will be differences in brain volume. So same as male versus female. And this goes directly with what you're saying. where it's about 71% prediction. So it's actually higher than heredity, that you can predict someone being a liberal or conservative based on looking at their brain and seeing some areas different than others. So in liberals, you have a larger anterior cingulate gyrus, which is the area responsible for taking in new information and the impact of new information on their decisions. So that is exactly very much underscoring this openness and changeability and flip-floppiness or whatever of liberalness.
It's going to be both of those things, both good and bad.
Exactly. And so on the conservative side, though, they have a larger, and okay, one caveat, this particular study was in self-described conservative students in London. So college students in London, self-described, that's a lot of questions for me. But, this tracks, though, because I'm on Fox. Well, Fox News, come on. So conservatives have a larger right amygdala. And the amygdala is fear and social learning area of the brain. So there's, of course, this adage that conservatives are liberals who grew up, who had life, kicked the shit out of them, and now they're no longer. So basically, sort of fear-minded thinking is.
Well, also autistic
therefore
spectrum
you would want change,
and
want change.
And sexual dimorphism. Both sexual dimorphism and autistic spectrum show differences in particular brain areas, and one of the most important brain areas that it shows the difference in is the amygdala. The size of it, the number of connections in it, and which one is dominant under certain...
Specifically the right one.
Left versus right dominance under certain uses. And so what they're talking about there is part of that, a category of mental proclivities that we see physiological differences in the brain that correlate with more of a conservative mindset versus a more liberal mindset, and they're going to very strongly correlate also, you'll find, with autistic spectrum.
Please stop.
Yes, hush, kitty.
Please.
Autistic spectrum versus the what was considered more neurotypical. But the thing is that it is important is that you'll see that differences in the right temporal parietal junction, the RTPJ, and there's a part area in the prefrontal cortex as well that I'm not going to talk about as much because I like focusing on the right TPJ because it's very cut and dried and clear about what the difference is there. But differences in the amygdala. The amygdala is social learning. We just give him some food or something, man. It's just STFU.
Just looking at the counter.
Good God, you son of a bitch. So yeah, what you find is that in the where'd you go? That's I see. You're going to use punishment instead of reward.
I fed them right before the stream.
I see. Okay.
I'm not certain that is
and then bringing up the squirt gun.
His intent is to be a nuisance, therefore.
Okay.
So actually, you talked about how you're not going to mention the prefrontal cortex all that much, but you did mention the temporoparietal junction. So I'm just going to really quickly put in again, where you have the right temporoparietal. You have the right temporoparietal junction, which has to do with morality, but the whole temporoparietal junction is the area of the brain where the temporal and the parietal lobes meet, which is why it's called that. And parietal is the side and temporal is the front, or is temporal the back? No, it's anterior. I was so bad with those always.
Yeah.
But anyway,
I
thought temporal was the front, but may not be. Or no, he's temporal the side.
It does not matter right now.
Sorry. It incorporates the information from the thalamus, the limbic system, as well as the visual, auditory, and all the other systems. The temporoparietal junction is responsible for collecting all this information, and processing it. It is also known to play a crucial role in self-other distinctions, as well as processing and the theory of mind. So this is where we would start getting into autistic territory. Damage to the TPJ, the temporoparietal junction, has been implicated in having adverse effects. People like damage to temporoparietal junctions.
It's becoming impossible to follow at this point.
Right.
Too many. In other words, let's try to stay on a track.
Well, I'm just saying that we're talking about the temporoparietal junction, and it actually does have to do with has to do with moral decisions and understanding of self and sort of like not exactly executive function, but in a certain way it very directly relates to autism.
Versus other.
Yes.
Having to do with
theory of mind.
It's specifically theory of mind.
Yes.
All of this. So,
and also
so basically, you're trying to talk about all the
experiences.
different things that are related together laterally with
Because the
autism,
temporoparietal junction
autism,
is responsible
morality,
for morality and autism,
Right.
which is what you're going to talk about. So
Yes,
I'm adding
right.
the
I was going to get to
neuroscience
that. I absolutely
aspect
was going to get
of
to
it. Okay,
that. Yes.
sorry.
Right.
Something
Jump
about
the
the prefrontal cortex.
Too much lateral.
I don't know what. Okay, go ahead. Oh, just the damage to the TPJ, or at least TPJ has been implicated in disorders including amnesia, Alzheimer's, and schizophrenia. So there's like personality and executive function and understanding of things that gets affected when TPJ is affected, and that just really keyed off the prefrontal cortex to me for some reason. I don't know why, but anyway, go ahead.
Okay. So where was I when you interrupted me the first time? What was I talking about? Now that my context has been completely shot through full of holes. It's like Swiss cheese now.
I'm trying to curb the cancer. Sorry, Charles. Apparently, there's a whole lot of cancer. Our English is too complicated. Sorry. But anyway, I can actually make the chat bigger, so maybe won't
Bigger?
Well, as in like taller, so it won't swallow as much. Swallow. Anyway. You were talking about how you weren't going to go into the PFC all that much, but you were talking about the
that was the second interruption. There was actually a first interruption. So that's the interruption of the interruption. So I'm trying to travel back a number of steps, but I'll just try to I'll try to pick up the pieces and go from here. Okay, so I was trying to talk about the way in which there's a dichotomy between.
Well, you were talking about openness versus that's where I came in with the
yes, adaptation.
Right.
Okay,
yeah.
I picked it back up. Yes. So it has to do with being adaptive versus sticking to something and punching through.
That's the core
difficulty.
disagreement between left and right.
Right, and so there's this dichotomy between immediacy versus the future. You'll find that is also true. That it's very similar to the individual versus the group. When you're talking about politics, there's always going to be this kind of a question that's going to come up with what is good for the moment versus what is good for a longer term. And these are going to be differences in political affiliation, that whether they focus on the bigger, larger picture that kind of doesn't pay as close attention to the details, and it kind of goes back and forth as well. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of overlap. So we can only really speak. When I'm speaking generally here, just take it for what it is. Of course, I understand it is extremely general, and there's a lot of exceptions. But I'm trying to paint an overall picture that shows the way in which these systems all work together. And so, where should I go from here? So, talking about the way in which you have these dichotomies that are in the mind. So the focus of political spectrum and how it relates in the brain. So we talked about the RTPJ. There is one of the differences between the more masculine brain and the more feminine brain, and that has to do with all these different brain areas: the amygdala, right temporal parietal junction, and there are some differences that are categorical, are found in the prefrontal cortex as well. But let's talk specifically about a particular morality that is different between people who have differences in the right temporal parietal junction. So the best way to categorize the difference, so like in some tests that they've done, now they found that this difference exists between people who are on the spectrum as well, and people who are more neurotypical, and they also were able to disable this area of the brain using magnets. Basically, they overstimulate the area, then it no longer will function after that point for a short period of time, and then they go and they ask questions and they find out how people's moral judgments about particular situations play out. And those situations, a good example of a very simple, direct question that they use, and they've got a lot of them that they've come up with, is let's say, for instance, a person who has is fixing coffee for someone else. And so they go, and there are 2 jars. One is labeled sugar, and the other is labeled poison. And in one case, the person, and they're labeled improperly. They're labeled exactly the opposite. And in one case, a person puts sugar in the coffee, meaning to put poison in it, obviously because they're labeled improperly, and brings that to the person to drink. And in the other case, they mean to put sugar in the coffee, but put poison in it. So basically, in one case, it is an accidental death versus a attempted murder that fails. And it is comparing these 2 things. So it comes down to, is it the thought that counts, or is it that results matter? And this you'll find is very strongly correlated between the moral viewpoints of liberal versus conservative, and I'll get to that in a moment. But so when they turn that area off, a person is more likely to basically say, okay, it's the results that count. The person who deserves the most punishment is the one who actually caused harm, versus when that area is more active in the more neurotypical brain, it is the person who attempted and failed that deserves more punishment, and who basically is more at fault. So basically the question is your morality about intention, or is your morality about results? And one of the things that you'll find with people who have autistic spectrum mentality is that because they do not have a good theory of mind, which means they are not capable of understanding other minds as well, period. That is there's a billion studies on that. I mean, you can't open up PubMed without running into studies on the when it comes to theory of mind and how that relates to autistic spectrum. And so if you do not possess a good theory of mind, then the thing that you must do, because I can't know what's in your head, is one of the things you also find with conservatives. I'm not a mind reader with men who are having to deal with women who actually are more capable of reading minds than men are. The thing that you'll end up defaulting to is, since I can't know what you intend, I must then therefore judge you based on what has happened,
right?
Because that's where the rubber meets the road. That's where the results count. And now looking at this, that can seem like a very negative thing right off the bat. It's like, if you only care about results, well, it depends on where your morality is, but if you only care,
depends on what country in the world you are.
Right, but
some cultures are,
But I mean, I think a lot of people, when they're just thinking about it like this, instead of in a deeper situation, when they're thinking about it analytically like this, they would typically go towards, well, it's obvious that the
analytical versus your emotional reactions, what you're talking
right.
about.
Whereas if you're in the yeah, exactly. If you're in the moment and it's a more complex situation, you're not directly examining the morality of a specific and simple situation, it's going to come out a little differently. And most people, I think, would lean towards the idea that it's like, an attempted murderer, his intention, if we know for sure his intention was really to try to kill somebody and he just failed, screw that guy, and let's forgive the person who it was an accident. And that's, I think most people, when they're analyzing it, that's what they're going to default to. But the truth of the matter is, when you do not have the information that others might actually have, then you have to default to a more effective strategy, basically. So here's the thing: because of the existence, because of the existence of deception, and some people, those people with a poorer theory of mind, of course, are not going to be as good at picking out deception as those with a better theory of mind. Because of the existence of deception, there is a necessity for just taking the results. And there are, in other words, the idea that being just results oriented seems cold and even kind of stupid, but it's not. There's a lot of situations in which it is extremely important. Like let's see, okay, so like for instance, if you're living in a desert, like one of the ideas is if you're in the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Like if a people,
well, every bad guy thinks of himself as like trying to do good. So you know,
if a people living in the desert are they are staying there and they're not adapting to the situation, they're just holding out in their location, and you begin to bring them food. This seems like a kind of a universal good in a certain way. Your intention is good. However, if the area is becoming more desertified, in other words, they're staying there too long, things are going badly and it's getting worse, and the availability of food is progressively getting worse while you are feeding them, then the moment you are not capable of feeding them, whereas they were capable of just barely eking by and maybe being able to move out of that area, now that you have been giving them food, you have disabled their ability to gauge that they absolutely must go now. You've disabled that, and so by attempting to do good, you have caused harm by disabling their ability to assess the situation properly and adapt and move when they absolutely should. Wow, they're fucking loud out there. Holy shit. Good God. So the point here is that theory of mind, when we think of it in one circumstance, the idea that it's the thought that counts is really, the greater good in one situation, and it is the greater evil in another situation. And so understanding that both of these are valuable pieces of information.
They go either way, really.
Right, and it's contextually dependent. It's one of the neatest things about the way in which genes work. If you study developmental biology, how genes, what they do is completely dependent upon the circumstance of the moment. And I'm switching here to just kind of to show there's this all throughout reality. You have this contextual dependence for that which is the best, that which is the greatest truth, is contextually dependent. So
like you say that there's no such thing as perfect objectively, there's only a perfect tool for a particular job.
Right. So like for instance, as the genes are the way in which a gene does things and decides like what should be happening to a given cell or what that cell should be changing into is all based upon the immediate signaling. And so there was, God damn it, there was something else I was getting to after this.
But it's contextually dependent.
Yeah, it has to do with contextual dependence. I had a point that was a previous point for a greater point that I've now lost. The contextual dependence of truth. That was really. And that which is valuable, and looking at the way rules. So going back to the whole idea of what is an immutable rule, what law do we make? There is no such thing as a law that is a universal good that does not take into account any context.
Abortion's murder. Oh wait.
Wait.
I'm just saying,
stop,
example of how conservatives and
that's
liberals
completely so opinion-based.
divide themselves
that
on
weakened
things
my
that
point,
are immutable.
Right, because some people will be emotionally attached to that instead of understanding what I'm saying. Where I didn't want to bring up something so emotionally charged at this point, because now what my point is going to be blocked by their emotions.
Okay, well, take that.
Yes, the point is that laws are, it's fucked now. All right, you're jumping around a little more than usual today. You're jumping between contexts is a little more unruly.
Well, because we're bringing together sort of how morality ties in with love versus right. So we're talking about making a law, because that's been a debate. That's been a hot topic debate recently, and in general, it's like, is it a woman's right to her body, or is it murder? So like, for instance, this is very, to me, central to what we're talking about, which is, and what you were saying, how to make a law. That's what we're trying to do. We're picking. Do we do the liberal approach, or do we do the conservative approach to this law?
There we go. Thank you. That was an excellent recovery. Yes. So the point is that there is, when you're making laws, they cannot be contextually independent, and that was something, as a child, I was always looking for unitary, specific truths that were immutable. I was not nearly as aware of the dependence of context for something to be an absolute truth. In other words, there is this idea that you can come to this one particular thing that is the best for all situations. It is just this immutable one thing that stands on its own, and that is just not how reality works. Individual little things don't stand on their own. They are dependent upon all of the circumstances around them. So, okay. And part of that, why I'm bringing that up, is because there is a difference in the autistic spectrum brain has less connection in it. In other words, like male brains have less myelin. Myelin is the coating around the axon that basically allows a signal to travel further. So it's kind of like
brain cells communicate to each other.
Right.
That's how you think, how everything happens.
So there's a greater amount of myelin, and the interconnectivity of the brain to greater is greater in neurotypical people. And so therefore what happens is in the autistic spectrum, which is also in the more male type of brain, there is less of a connection between a broad area of topics. So therefore we are capable of focusing more upon a specific thing and throwing out all those extraneous other thoughts to be able to take one specific path and think it down to the very important finite details. So
speaking of jumping around extraneously, this may be something that I didn't cover in our autism shows, but it is something I mentioned in the Sluts and Scholars podcast that I was on. I'm going to link that somewhere at some point, probably in the Patreon description or some such. But I don't know if you heard this or not, BB. Okay, but I was going to say it for your benefit as well. Alright, well, I guess not the founder, that's a silly way of putting it. The man who discovered, who classified, who named Asperger's disorder, so that's one of the autism spectrum disorders or differences of the brain from neurotypical brains. Is it's named after him. His name was Hans, I think, Asperger, and he discovered this difference. He was a pediatrician, and he worked with kids, and some kids were very different than others, and so he named this proclivity Asperger's, and that's now classified as one of the autism spectrum. It's more of a high-functioning autism, and what he called Asperger's is the malification of the brain. So I don't know if we're going to do a show on this directly by itself. I mean, I would like to actually go back over the male versus female sexual dimorphism and, brain structures, and, yes, you can tell whether a brain is male or female by just looking at it. Yes, you can, it's true. Specifically some brain areas, but overall, in general as well. Yeah, there is size and volume difference, but anyway. So maybe we'll do a show on male versus, or male, sexual dimorphism. There we go, that's better. Because I don't want it to be versus, I just don't want, because they are complementary in my opinion. But if we do that show, we can talk about the testosterone and the male aspect and how that ties into autism, because that's, as I was saying, what Asperger, like the guy who classified the disorder, he called it the extreme maleness of the brain, is what Asperger's is. So there's ways in which testosterone, which is what makes something a male brain, how testosterone affects your brain areas, your cognition, your all that.
So I guess the point is, I want to point out that I still believe people who are on the spectrum are like humanity 2.0 in beta. That there is but at the same time, I think there's also a dependence. There's an interdependence between people who are kind of on the spectrum and people who are not. In those sorts of mental types, there is a dependence between the two mental types that we need both of them to best find the solutions to the collective problems that we need to solve. I've got a bunch of
work together, man.
I've got a bunch of studies here that will I guess we'll link somewhere at some point. Where I'll let you put it wherever is publicly available. But I have links to a bunch of studies about how the disconnectivity of the the various brain areas that show that social cognition is something that is lesser in both the male brain and in the autistic spectrum brain, and the white matter growth being different. Like one of the things that is interesting with autistic disorder is we actually have early white matter growth followed by slower white matter growth later in life. So in other words, we have more white matter growth early and then less later on. So there's there's like an early. Say again.
All humans? Or?
No, this is for
Autistics?
autistic spectrum, right? And there's a lot of interesting this was specific autistic disorder. So yeah, it's going to be like the right. Yeah, you do have to kind of
like the
what
kind
level of
they
autistic,
use
like
humans as
dysfunctionally,
furniture.
right?
Like, no eye contact. No physical contact. Like climb on their human parents instead of hugging them.
Right, exactly.
Really heartbreaking shit for some
objects.
parents.
Right. There is a disconnection between their ability. So I've said it before, and I want to kind of reiterate that what you find is a lot of our instincts, those things that give us information that is existed beforehand, that are kind of our BIOS, our boot up from starting right out, has to do with the amygdala. I think a lot of our instincts.
The Windows 98 that comes pre-installed.
That connects us and allows us to understand.
Kathy.
I mean, it's obviously spread through various brain areas, of course.
What is that?
Theory of mind. Basically, our theory of mind, our ability to, our instincts about what certain things with the face mean, what certain
our instincts on how to behave in social situations.
Our instincts on how to, all of those things, basically are links to instincts. As people who are more autistic are weaker, we are not as closely linked with it, and that's once again a double-edged sword. By not being as closely linked with instincts, you're not nearly as driven by instinct.
So would it be?
But the wisdom of instincts, that learned, there's millions of years of testing and learning that occurred to create our instincts in the first place. So we're also without that wisdom. So there's a gain and a loss.
So would it be fair to say that the interconnectivity is responsible for being more in neurotypicals? Is responsible for being more primate-like? Because there's a question on Quora asking like, can you think with your lower brain versus your higher brain? I'm like, what is this? But it did get me to think. And so,
So probably yes. There's probably more of a close connection would be early in life, especially with the primate part of ourselves, which is the part that is, when we think about what the primate is and what instincts are, it's crucial to understand that it is a lot of years of millions of years of learning that is stored in instincts, so yes, they're connected to that, and a little more, I think, but that connection to that then shapes the direction that their brain is going to go, as opposed to, which means it's going to be focused more on social issues, whereas one of the things that you find in autistic spectrum, and the reason why I think it's not some sort of genetic anomaly that doesn't have a value. It has I think it's been honed and specialized specifically to provide what it does, and that is like we gain increased visual spatial reasoning. One of the things that is found across autistics all the way to the dysfunctional ones is increased visuospatial reasoning, the ability to three-dimensionally rotate objects. So
very, 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 very
tool development, exactly. The development of tools. I believe it is specifically autism that made us not be monkeys anymore, and that is what gave us these tools, and so therefore, probably
I never started sharpening sticks because we're all fucking conservative assholes. Ready to kill each other.
Right. So the thing is,
out-group. See, that's what we're talking.
Competition versus cooperation, and both of them are extremely good and extremely bad.
Well, it depends if you have if you're cooperating within a group versus groups competing with each other.
The point is that too much cooperation. Okay, so whenever an animal no longer has any predators, one of the things that occurs is that it becomes weaker and weaker and weaker because they eat every genetic anomaly.
Beauty at any size.
Any genetic anomaly that would not be functional ends up being kept and progressing instead of being cut off and shaved off of the creature. And so,
which, I mean, that is more a draconian approach. So we are trying to have a more comfortable, happy, cuddly, cozy civilization. But on the other hand, that we are still primates living on this planet, and we do need to be somewhat physically fit to, you know.
Right. Well, one of the things we've done is we've started to eliminate
balance.
all those things which are the crucial aspects of competition. And the thing is, there's two different kinds of competition, and everybody has a basic sense about the two kinds of competition, and they call it good sportsmanship. In other words, people compete, and then there's competition without any kind of rules, without any consideration of fairness or starting condition or anything like that. Not an attempt to sharpen each other, but attempt to destroy each other, and by any means necessary. And so that's where deception, that's where all of the rule breaking, all of those types of things, by breaking rules and by exploiting and finding little things, what one can do is, instead of creating greater value, is instead an exceptional situation that can just be...
It's exploitative instead of...
Right, well, that's the thing, is understanding why do we hate exploitation. And one of the things that you find is that in nature, anytime that there is an exploitive behavior, there's tons of animals that exploit each other, because it just will keep popping up. It always will. But you'll find that nature always is finding a way to destroy exploitation. And because exploitation... will eventually lead to the end of a species. In other words, if a species starts to bend itself towards exploiting something that does not value anything really productive for objectively productive for the situation that it's in, it will over a very long term, right? It will self-destruct over time.
That's a great quick segue.
Like locusts are just barely within that perspective. They're barely within the zone of being able to still exist. And the reason why is because they only become locusts in huge groups and with a gigantic availability of resources. When there's not a huge availability of resources, they do not do that super swarming thing. They don't breed as much, they don't eat as much, they don't swarm as much, they don't do any of those things. And because, exactly, they do use a form of quorum sensing, that's exactly what they do, to become locusts. Otherwise, they're just grasshoppers.
That's a great segue. You said nature finds ways to punish exploiters. So this is fantastic. A really quick thing in my research when I was doing the left versus right sort of approaches to morality and things in general. You have these games that you have researchers have people play in order to figure out game theory or evolutionary game theory, like prisoner's dilemma, or more often than not, is sharing money. And it's like, if you both decide to share the money, then the pot doubles, or if one of them steals, it's one of those.
So the point is,
Wait, just really quick, I didn't finish.
Damn it.
So I never got to that.
Go ahead.
No. So what they found is that oxytocin, the trust molecule, does have a lot to do with sort of morality. How much will you cheat someone versus how much you will act fair. It does have to do with trustworthiness. So the interesting thing about all that is that conservative men, for instance, actually shared less. However, whenever you give them an option to pay from some of the money that they earned to punish those who cheated, they paid more to punish others. So it's really interesting that they actually were doing it themselves. But they, whenever given the opportunity to curb cheating or to curb some sort of, so nature found a way to, sort of the more conservative approach to morality, or of morality from the conservative side. They're like, hey, let's curb this cheating because, nature finds a way to,
Right, to curb cheating. And the reason is because something that exploits... my favorite example is something called the green frog. What a fucking just nondescript name for a frog. But they one of the things that they do is they are in the middle of a transitionary point of attempting to eliminate an exploitative behavior. And what that behavior is so one of the ways that the females choose the best mate is by the depth of the frog's croak. In other words, the frequency. When it is a lower frequency,
indicates size, right?
It indicates size. Size is a real value indicator
tangible,
of
measurable.
That creature was able to survive for a long period of time and able to gather resources, so therefore it has real value. However, a sum of the individuals of that species, basically, there's not an intention here, of course, it just so happens that some were born with a deeper croak, and they started getting breeding rights by basically exploiting that system. I mean, there's nothing conscious going on here at all. I mean, it's just exploitation just ends up occurring because there was reward for it, but at the same time, so here you've got smaller frogs that are croaking deeper and therefore able to get mates that they should not be able to get, because the females attempt to select an actually better performer is being undermined. So in response to that, one of the things that has started to happen is, which one was it? They've started this weird attacking behavior where they attack. I think they attack those that come around them to basically induce competition. In other words, when a male comes to them, or maybe it's the other way around. Damn it! It's been a while since I looked into this. Now I'm confused about it. But there's basically one of the things that they do is they induce actual competition. The frogs, and I don't remember if it's the male or the female. I'm pretty. It may be the female, but I could be wrong about that.
Gotcha.
But where they they basically induce competition to find which is the actual valuable one of the two,
like
by physically right. And so there is this, and it seems, I remember it's just a behavior. Damn it, I'm gonna have to look that up. Right. Because the behavior itself, they're attacking each other during mating. So it's like, why would they be attacking each other during mating? Develop this.
That means like it's.
Yeah, it's male to female. You're right. It's so there is.
So regardless who instigates it, it's male to female. That's
right.
Interesting.
There's this male to female fighting that occurs.
So like lions,
in the
right?
Yeah.
The lion females, they challenge the male.
Exactly. They're strength testing. Exactly. Yeah. So there is this behavior that has been added to attempt to eliminate the exploitative
imposters.
The imposters. And so you'll find that nature is constantly attempting to get back to an even ground, because there is a real, if that system isn't in place, the genes don't go forward. That's what it comes down to. If there's not some system in place to eliminate the exploitation, then the creature becomes actually less capable of surviving, and if it becomes actually less capable of surviving, it doesn't survive, so therefore the genes aren't here anymore. And so one of the things that you'll find is that these end up being kind of built-in systems into genes, to finding and eliminating exploitation, and part of the way in which you do that is through competition. And so that's why that competition ends up being so important. But competition,
it's sort of an in-group thing, which is a more
competition in group, yes, exactly. Small groups competing. That's why we love, sports and things like that as a species. Why we love those things is because competition between things eliminate. They get down to the truth. Even though that we have to be able to use communication. Like a peacock creates larger feathers because that is a communication. I'm capable of gathering resources, and you need to be able to gather that kind of information, for good breeding and for the species to continue properly. But at the same time, you need competition to find out if there are people, if there are individuals within the species that are exploiting the signals. Like, for instance, now somebody
like
who
every
is
commercial ever?
Like somebody who all that they do is they don't actually. Okay, in civilization, it's okay to be able to just con people and take their money when you look at it from a completely dead computer-like perspective of if that is survivable within that situation, to be an exploitive taker within civilization, the context of civilization, is actually a workable strategy, so long as you can get away with it, and civilization doesn't punish it enough.
Well, Nash Clipper endorses it.
Right. So but from a perspective of living in smaller communities, those which are not actually producing anything of value, but simply live based upon their ability to exploit the trust systems that keep the community together, that is not a viable system.
Oh, your knees don't get broke.
Exactly.
Not a viable system at all.
And so just understanding that that's part of the reason why we try to induce competition to find, because what is it, by stealing money, what is it that an individual is doing? Well, money has to do with, it's just like that frog's weight. It is a by showing you got the cars and the money, you got you are basically showing that you have the capability of providing for offspring. That's in a certain way, or creating more viable offspring in one way or another, because the female instincts went towards that. Towards identifying those who are more capable of gathering resources, and that's so some of the symbols of people capable of producing and gathering resources. But then the exploitation systems always end up developing, and so that's why we have competition. So anyway, so that's the point, is that there's this competition versus cooperation. But there's a difference between the type of competition, and the competition to destroy, to absolutely take everything that is destroying, that only should be occurring in a condition in which the species is about to go extinct.
Yeah, because otherwise it will make the species go extinct.
Right, because we actually have that instinct as well. That instinct exists because it's a system. When you're in a desert, yes, in other words, like if you're as a species, pick any fucking species that exists in a desert, and because they live such on the edge of absolute destruction, they need to be able to sense when resources have suddenly gone down, so if the species wants to survive, in other words, if you want the species itself to survive, then instead of cooperating,
it's gonna print some shit.
They need to switch to taking from everybody, kill every motherfucker who ain't me, and take their shit, because then what you've done is
it's preferable for one asshole to survive of that species than for all of them to die.
Exactly. One completely non-cooperative asshole is going to show that he's the strongest because he could fight and take and get the resources from those around them, and therefore then that one asshole survives, the species survives the drought. And so that's what being an asshole is for. That's what being a piece of shit is for surviving when it gets down to the rubber meets the road, when shit hits shit hits the fan, rubber meets the road, there is, and it's in the species is about to go fucking extinct. That is the anti-extinction mechanism. So anyway, that's kind of how is this all related?
Conservatives are assholes.
Conservatives actually are a little better adapted to inducing cooperation. Competition versus cooperation. In other words, whereas, and so that is for refining. That is
liberals fall the fuck apart.
whereas the liberal mindset is more for when things are plentiful.
Bounty.
Exactly. When there is a bounty. When you want to be able to try out as many different, because what nature wants to do is it wants life to survive. In other words, it's the reason why anything is currently here is because it survived. And the way that you survive is by creating as many alternative templates. You create as many alternative templates of behavior, of existence, of many different species as you possibly can. So therefore that means you allow more. In other words, more deformed. That which is deformed is no longer deformed. It's an attempt at another template that you preserve. And so therefore the more liberal mindset, and of course both the liberal and the conservative exist in everybody, that left versus right, that exists in everybody to one extent or another, and from one moment to the next you're going to be more situations
group, people
but this is a general perspective based systems a top level systems analysis that I'm trying to show here. So the so that's why in the rainforest you have 10,000 birds that are fairly closely related, doing a million different little dances, and wasting time because they, because what value is all that? It's not really all that particularly valuable. But the point is that they become strong at that, they become good at that, and it's basically the ability to create a lot of different species, because that's what life is doing. Is when something happens, when you burn down the rainforest, for instance, and the situation has changed, some of the rainforest animals that after you cut and burn down the rainforest, some of the animals that were there end up still surviving because they were attempting to try as many different niches as possible. Even though our circumstances have created where only certain types of plants grow after that point, because there were so many different templates in that rainforest, one of them was filling this tiny little weird niche to be able to adapt to this circumstance, where this one particular weird circumstance that is now available.
So both are
after.
Necessary, or what?
So the point is, that's why you create a lot of templates. The whole idea is to create a million different templates so that when things change, something is going to be able to fit that new situation. And it's basically trying a million different things at once and having as many different opportunities available as possible. And that's why we have this massive differentiation in species. But at the same time, there is, as circumstances become more narrow, you need to be able to narrow it down to the right thing. So there's this perspective, this systems design principle we can learn from the way that nature has designed life. And so that's one of the things we're finding in any kind of development of complex systems, is we look at the way life develops complex systems, and it's based upon this growth and pruning perspective that is contextually based, and that is very
cycling between the two.
It's very closely. There's a lot of there's a lot of overlap, of course. Like, for instance, conservative people are more about the preservation of more babies. Like, let's have lots of babies, tons of babies. Let's just cover the fucking planet with babies. But in general, but that's not necessary. That has more to do with the religious, the adherence to religious values, whereas they are more of the pruning. In other words, conservative values are more about pruning things down to that which is valuable, that which is.
But I mean, if conservatives,
whereas liberals are more permissive of, let's let everything exist. Let's let every bad template continue going, and let's just So there's
every opinion is just as valid.
Right, every opinion is just as valid. Let's not narrow anything down to one thing being better than another. Let's just have a billion different perspectives, and all of them just as valuable as one another. So there's this kind of, you can see this perspective of liberal versus conservative, and you can see this perspective in the brain and a balance between the two, and you can see the way in which a cycling between the two is very important, because you can either, if you go too far to one side or the other, without the pruning, the growth becomes weakness, and without the growth, then the pruning becomes over specialization, which is breeding in weakness itself, because the situation will absolutely change, because reality changes.
And studies have found that conservatives are hotter than liberals.
I bet, because they're not as permissive, because they're requiring more of their
breeding partners,
exactly,
themselves,
of
their
everything.
standards.
Their standards, they're pruning things down more.
And it's interesting that we're talking about this right now, because
there's also when it comes to disgust, people who are both women and liberals are less prone to disgust. In other words, the disgust instinct is not as strong. The looking at things from a like, ooh, that's gross. And so that whole idea of purity, as you were saying before, that actually very strongly goes with the more liberal mindset as well.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, actually. The thing going cycling between growth and pruning, liberal and conservative mindsets. Because, I mean, essentially, it is all about the morals, and the left and the right agree on the basic of fairness and harm. So harm care and fairness, they both care about that. So that is sort of the actual basis of morality. And then occasionally you need to adjust the other three: the in-group, the purity, and the authority. So occasionally you need to have authority when shit's like, when you need to, when there's war or when something going on, you need to obey the elders. You need to do what you gotta do.
You need to choose the more proven and older way of doing things.
Sometimes you need the in-group thing because, for instance, the researcher who was doing research into multiculturalism and diversity, he actually found that diversity, thought he was going to find that diversity and multiculturalism strengthens society, but he actually found that it degrades it. And he's like, well, shit, maybe in the future, maybe it sets it up to be good in the future or something. Anyway, the point is, in a good society where you do have cohesion, like Switzerland actually was used as an example, what they have is individual boroughs that have complete autonomy and are allowed to segregate. And then they just like hang out and they mingle. And in fact, Soviet Russia had that, where it had just a bunch of countries that were still their own country. People, because sometimes, you might have a conflict between this country and that country, or this borough or this culture and that culture, but you are part of the same country. So what are you going to do? It actually, studies have found that when you segregate in a way, or separate, allow the people themselves to do it. That's the crucial part. Leave people alone. Let them do their own thing. And don't try to fuck with them. And they will segregate into their own little cultures, and then they will commingle, and they will not have as many instances of clashing with each other. And so, for instance,
that's think about this.
Something that you need to cycle between, though. You will need to accept refugees if you want to be like not a total fucking asshole country, but then you also need to scale back and integrate.
And let's think about this from a long-term perspective. We all know that inbreeding leads to genetic
deformities,
genetic problems. Mm-hmm. So then what happens when so what ends up happening is you have like an island population. One of the things that'll happen is that they end up becoming more and more inbred because there is not a diversity created in the genes if they're all interbreeding. So if you have everyone interbreed a whole lot, then you have basically one set of genes. And so once people are done interbreeding, if they continually are constantly interbreeding and there's no specialization allowed, then what happens is you end up creating a situation where that interbreeding leads to a diminishing returns situation. So, like for instance, you put a bunch of people, different ethnicities on an island. At first, their children will be fantastically, they'll have that hybrid vigor because they've got a lot of different genes from a lot of different places. Their hybrid vigor will make them all like, their immune systems will be better. They'll be fucking beautiful Olympic a lot of times because of the interbreeding. However, what ends up happening is you take this enough generations down the line, because once they all have all of the genetics that were there, and over time it's been basically pruned down to one specific set of genes. Then after time they are interbreeding again. Now they're inbreeding is what I mean, not interbreeding. They're now inbreeding. And then basically what you have is a situation where they no longer have the benefits. So there is this cycling between breeding together and splitting off that is necessary, which has to do with generalization and specialization going back and forth, because you need a system to find good specializations and to strengthen particular properties that might be adapted to specific situations, and then need to remarry them. And you'll see that there's this cycle. So in other words, once again, you have a homeostasis type of system that exists because of a cycling between opposites, and not just a direct balance between the two that is static.
Real quick, we have a question from one of our patrons from much earlier in the chat, but I got it now. So you mentioned how are the liberals and conservatives divided in the study. Which study is that? Because we mentioned quite a few of them, but one of them for the right amygdala being bigger is self-identification, and for the temporoparietal junction, do you have any methods on that?
Methods?
As in, like, was it self-identified liberal or conservative, or like I'm assuming most of these studies are going to be self-identified liberal or conservative, because how else are you going to confirm that part of it?
Well, I mean, you could, exactly. I mean, it's going to come down to, you could say, okay,
like
do you
can't
believe...
pull down their pants and see if it's liberal or conservative, unlike with the male or female dimorphism. But once they do self-identify and you do look at their brains, there is a divide that is statistically significant.
Right. Yeah. there's going to be. That's why you have to have larger and larger, as large a sample as possible, of course. So if it's when you look at a study, if it's
30,000 people,
right? Exactly. If you study 12 people or something, then your study is garbage.
Yeah.
But the things that we're talking about, there are multiple studies that you can look into. I recommend one of the best things you can do is learn how to Google search a site, and then instead of using NCBI's search.
It's so shitty.
Sometimes it's got. I actually go back and forth.
I do go back and forth.
You need to be able to Google. Well, you first have to be good at Google searching, because that's which if you're good with databases, then you should still be pretty good with Google searching. But there's techniques to Google searching that are. I'm going too far afield. Fuck that. The point is that I recommend Google searching the NCBI database to PubMed.
You're getting too autistic about
it.
If you want to find the exact finite most,
you really need to learn database terms, because Google used to be really good with that. Now it sucks, so you have to use the special tool on there to make it work like that anymore, and it pisses me off.
You can have a Sprag out. It's okay.
Okay. All right. You used to be able to search it like a database. It worked so great. And then they just made it. Then they made it for normies.
Then they became evil.
Then they made it for normies. Now it sucks. But anyway, yeah. So if you want to find, and then you can use specific search terms to find it. But I do have a list of studies that we'll make available for.
They will be available. Patreon.com/AnnaCherry. We have all of our CherrySTEM podcast stuff there. They are publicly available. So all you gotta do is click on the CherrySTEM tag, and it'll bring up all the 19 episodes, and then I will be uploading this one in the next few weeks. And that's where the show notes and all the links will go. They will be in the description post of the CherrySTEM podcast on Patreon. Speaking of Patreon, we actually have come to the end of our show, and
I wanted to finish just a little bit. Sure. So one of the things I did want to, like I said, I would be criticizing the Asperger's, the autistic spectrum folks, and that's one of the things I want to point out is that what weaknesses do we need to focus on? The weaknesses I focused on is finding that there is a one of the things that you'll find among people who are extremely mathematically inclined, which is to say they're aspy as hell, is that there is a weakness with metaphors and analogies. In other words, there is the pedantic focus upon details makes it difficult to recognize the similarities between large sets of data. In other words, any kind of disparity between sets of data ends up getting kicked out because we tend to focus on the details too much. And it is the ability to recognize larger scale patterns that comes with a greater level of connectivity in the brain. In other words, there is a reduced level of connectivity. We need to accept that this is part of what occurs in a more masculine brain, is there's less connectivity between the brain areas. And it's one of those, it's a strength and a weakness. The strength is being able to focus on the details, being able to look at the finite things, being able to follow a path and all of its steps and keep going and keep following that path. But that following that one path is often to the limitation of considering larger and broader sets of data. It is to the limitation of changing and exploring other sets of information when they should be explored. It is to the exclusion of allowing pattern mismatch in favor of a larger set of matches. In other words, we'll look at, okay, this pattern mismatches in this one particular way, boom, done. No, I'm not looking at it anymore. And that's what one of the things that that people who are more masculinized, more on the autistic spectrum will do, is that they will kick out a pattern the moment that there's a slight mismatch between the two, whereas if they simply were connecting a larger set of data, which is more breadth all at the same time, in other words, more disparate facts that strengthen each other in a lateral sense. In other words, they provide proof in a more, this is difficult to bring out, but there is a lateral connectivity in which it's dependent upon the context around it. The facts around a fact strengthen it in a way. And if you think this out, you could I'm sure you could see what I'm talking about. But the point is that there is a once you take a larger set of data, and this is something, I guess, you'd call it wisdom. As a person gets older, they can basically look at larger amounts of information and see how, well, this and this and this and this and this and this all agree with this, and it's basically kind of like a white space. In other words, there's a creation whereas that detail is not connected. Is a good example. And can we show that image of both the faces and the dragons, where the pattern mismatches don't matter as much, because the white space around this one particular thing, even though you don't have this piece of data, you have all this data that's coming in from a variety of angles that outlines only one specific pattern that could exist in this place, because it's cut off from here, and 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 there's all these ways in which only a certain thing will fit in that white space. And even though you do not have this data, you still have this data. And being able to do that requires a lot of interconnectivity of information. And the interconnectivity of information is something that is actually missing to some extent in brains that are more capable of that specialization, more following that linear path. And so is that the okay? So here we have two dragons. And this is also, I love this picture because it has multiple concepts in it. One of them is the fact that there is multiple layers of meaning can exist in the same information. But it specifically is showing here that there is something made up in the white space. The white space creates the face, whereas you could look at it and only see dragons. And it's very possible to only see dragons. But then there's also, there is a perspective that there is a face in there. Now, of course, that does lead to errors. There is, I understand, you can see false patterns. I've brought this out numerous times as well. But the point is, it is an ability that tends to be lacking to a certain extent because of the inability to see the whole thing at once. Which, there's a great anecdote about it. When she first bought this poster for me, she had it in a roll, and she rolled out and all I could see at first was the dragons, and she just kind of rolled it out and was showing it to me, and all I saw, because I didn't see the whole thing at once, all I saw was the dragons. I was like, oh, that's a nice poster, and it wasn't until the whole thing was open that I'm like, oh, holy shit, there it is. And because I could only see
I was so
one
disappointed at first.
Right. I guess she thought I'd love it, and she was right. But the thing is, she was only showing me a little bit at a time. I could only see a little bit of the picture at a time. That's like in your brain. If your brain doesn't connect a lot of sets of information, you're only seeing one part of it at a time, and you're not seeing all of it at the same time. And this is actually curable, because I won't get into that right now. But the point is, there is the amount of data that is analyzed simultaneously in a certain way is crucially important to the way in which we pattern recognize. I was only capable of recognizing the dragons because I could not see the whole picture at once. And because I only saw them a little bit at a time, even once I saw the whole thing, I wasn't putting it together immediately because I followed each little piece along the way and put together the dragons. I even once the whole thing was open for a while, I didn't see the face. It was only after looking at it again later that I was able to, instead of being led by each part of the dragon that I saw, the piece that was right there in front of me, being led by that, I could not see the white space pattern. And so that is something that is a weakness that exists in the conservative perspective is the specialization leads to this weakness, and so that's one of the things I wanted to point out, is that is something that we should always, we recognize the weakness in. Like I think I've pointed out a lot of the liberal weaknesses when it comes to false pattern recognition, when it comes to basically not being able to being stuck in analysis paralysis, not moving forward, vacillating too much between various choices instead of picking one and actually making something happen. Like, there's a lot of different things we can see that is a deficit with one side, but the deficits of the other side don't freaking matter if you're trying to improve yourself. The deficits within yourself is what matter and what you should be focused on if you're attempting to improve yourself. If you're just trying to improve other people, well, you're just kind of fucking up anyway. But it's about trying to find those things in yourself that you can look at and find. And the other thing, of course, is a poor theory of mind. It is just, we have to accept that there is a lack of ability to empathize. And this is one thing, well, there's two different kinds of empathy. And that is the autistic version of empathy and real empathy. And I want to point out the difference between the two, because it's something I put some thought into, because it was something that I kind of did. And in one case, it's like, okay, it's like, yeah, I can put myself in another person's shoes. Yeah, I can do that. Everybody can do that. Who can't do that? And this is what happens with a person who has a poor theory of mind, is they don't understand there's two ways to put yourself in another's shoes, and that is overwriting their personality, overwriting their situation, overwriting all of that with your personality and your situation, and then comparing that to the one singular thing or that is being examined. So what I mean by this is that you're, instead of their context of their life and all the things that surround them that aren't immediately visible, you're instead saying, if I were them, I wouldn't do X. So you're examining that one, I wouldn't do X, entirely from your perspective. You are not putting yourself in their shoes, even though it appears that you are. You have this delusion that you are, because you are imputing and overwriting their actual situation. Whereas being in their shoes is the capability of modeling not being you, and being somebody who has had to experience this and this and this and this and this and this, and look at it from that perspective. In other words, being able to create in your mind a perspective that you don't currently have, based on, I believe, like for instance, if you think something is likely, that happens automatically to you. You just kind of think that things are likely and think some things are unlikely. But to be able to empathize, you need to be able to feel as though this thing that you normally think is likely is very unlikely, or vice versa. You need to be able to understand what it is like to have experienced the life experiences of that person. And this is something that people who are on the spectrum aren't doing, and they think they are. They're not, but they think they are. They're just fucking certain they are, but they're not. And one of the ways in which people actually gain empathy a lot of times is through reading novels. What you'll find is people who are a lot more moderate, I believe that they start out, a lot more conservative a lot of times, and then through reading novels and basically really putting themselves in the perspective of a mind that has to make these weird decisions, it ends up, like, I think one of the things that really started leading me in that direction was reading the fantasy series, the Elric fantasy series, by Michael Moorcock.
Well, fantasy reading literally makes
right,
people more
Elric of Melnibone, I don't know. The point is, it's the Elric series, and in it, he tells you these circumstances of all these weird just fucked up circumstances where Elric has to make these just shitty fucking decisions. They're horrible. And from an outside perspective, if you did not know his perspective, you would see him as a villain. And reading extensively about a person who is forced by circumstances, and where you're like, yeah, I'd make that, given the circumstances and the only logic available, and the only thing, I would make that shit decision too, because it's the only shit decision that you can even make there. And then you follow down a path of shitty decision after shitty decision that is created by the circumstances, and that is empathy, where you see a person who you would normally see as a complete fucking villain, and instead you're like, yeah, but he's a villain not of his own making. Yes, he is a villain, but he didn't have any other rational decision to make. He couldn't have, there was nothing else he could fucking do. Being able to have that perspective is what actual empathy is. It is not imputing who I am on you and pretending you've had all the same advantages. You have, a completely, and that's the thing that
morals.
Right, all the same morals, all the same ideas, all the same experiences. It's and that's what people think walking among another person's shoes is, when they are too far to the conservative side. And understanding this, I think, is really valuable in making very conservative people into moderates. And truthfully, I believe that's where the power lies in all of this, is because and the funny thing is, I'm not sure. Okay, I know how to bring somebody who's got a structured mind and make it and where they're really more pedantic and more artistic and things like that, because I've been there. I know how to go more towards the middle with that. I really don't know how to, when somebody comes from a perspective of where everything's chaos and nothing has a whole lot of value greater, where they don't have a hierarchy of values and they don't have a basis for truth. I don't know how to create organization in that mind and bring them.
Slightly autistic.
Right. I don't know
like
how
me.
Exactly.
You do know how to.
And that's one of the things I think in child development, by the way.
Yeah. You know how to raise children from a sort of like, oh my God, everything's a soup, into a rational thing.
Well, the important thing though for a child, for instance, is that they need. One of the things that if a child does not have strong borders when they are first growing up, that the terrible twos, what it's all about is they're testing their borders. They're trying to find out, is there any truth in the world? Is anything solid? If I push here, does it push back, or is it just, okay, nothing there? Oh shit, nothing there. Well, how do I push myself around in this world? And when it comes to the rules and my interactions with other people, or is it all just what I feel in a given moment and just trying to, is it all just about what I feel, or is there some sort of hard borderlines? And I think that children that are given a structured upbringing and that is very rule based and things like that, I think that is extremely valuable for their minds, because then after that, then they can start to see all the exceptions to the rules. Then they can start to address all the ambiguity of life. But I think without a grounding in that, if they start right out with everything in life is ambiguous and there is no truth, and there is no.
Research proves you're right. I mean, children need a stable sort of rules, discipline type of thing.
And so I think it's harder for a person to go
not
from completely
unloving, like dickish rules. We're not talking about abuse. We're talking about
basically just like, okay, you can't do this, you can't do that. Basically just
loving,
a hard
but swift
line.
Discipline and
swift,
very
immediate,
very
specific,
clear, distinct,
unemotional. Well,
things,
the biggest thing that people do wrong with child rearing is they discipline based on their emotional state. Whether it's they've annoyed them enough or pissed them off enough to punish them, instead of instantly the rule is broken. Instantly there is this moderate, well-known exact punishment that is specific.
Understanding of why you're being punished. I
remember my son coming and confessing to me when he done wrong. I'm like, and wanting to have some sort of punishment. I was like, no, it's not necessary. You understood you did it. It's great, but I guess the point is like, it seems like it would be harder to come from a perspective of not having any basis for truth, not having any basis for reality, and then accepting that there are certain hierarchies and there are valuable systems, and one thing works better than another, and things have to be assembled in a way that will work.
It is fundamental for people's happiness, which is why women have been steadily unhappy since the 80s. I'm just saying.
And so I don't know how to get that.
Year.
How do you get somebody who's completely unstructured to understanding structure?
You
seems harder than taking.
No, I know. You just entheogens. There's only one thing you can do.
Entheogens. Yeah. Actually, that's helpful for both sides.
Yeah.
But, okay. Now you can end it. That was
right.
I just wanted to finish with that.
That's cool. I am going to probably try to advertise this in the beginning of our podcast, but yeah, we have an after show with patrons. So become a patron, and you can be part of the after show. And we're gonna answer questions and talk more about various points raised. And we also have a special video we're gonna watch. It's a TED Talk on morality, and it's neat. So we're gonna do that with patrons now on Patreon. All you gotta do is become a patron, and you can join us on Patreon. The Hangout is right there. It's the most recent update that's gonna be on there, and keep an eye on my Patreon as well for the show notes and the links and the audio version of this podcast coming in the next few weeks. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you guys for our call-in show in a week or so, and then for the next CherrySTEM next month in March. Okay.